Okay, and transcription started. Okay, well, welcome everybody back to the Heidegger and Classical Thought Reading Group for 2025-2026. I'm just going to hand straight over to Laurence, who's prepared today's presentation and will be talking on Heidegger's beginning in Parmenides. And Laurence.
Aaron, thank you very much indeed. I want to say a huge welcome back to so many familiar faces. It's really very exciting to see so many people who've been with us, some of you, for quite a few years. This is, I think, if I'm correct, our fifth online year, and the second time, therefore, that we will touch on one of Heidegger's lecture courses that concerns Parmenides. I also want to say a huge welcome to those of you who are new to us for the first time and here for the first time. So I apologize to those of you who are familiar with the reading group. I'm going to run through just some basic housekeeping of how we normally conduct the group. First off, this is the Heidegger and Classical Thought reading group. What that means is that we have been considering for a number of years the relationship between Martin Heidegger and the texts in classical thought that he considered. We started off, I think, as long ago as 2019 with a consideration of Heidegger's sophist lectures, and that got interrupted by COVID. And then we resumed with a consideration of Heidegger's 1932 lectures on Parmenides and Anaximander. We then proceeded to volume 40 of the Gesamtausgabe, the Einführung in die Metaphysik lectures, which were published in German in 1953, given in 1936. And now we are considering this time volume 54, which is simply titled Parmenides. It was originally entitled, as far as we know, Parmenides and Heraclitus. But in fact, there's almost no mention of Heraclitus in this text. And as we will discover, sometimes even Parmenides seems to disappear, at least to some extent, from view. Let me just say a few words about the texts themselves that we will work from. The Parmenides lectures were some of the first lecture of Heidegger's lecture courses to be published. They certainly weren't the first. The first course was published, I think, in 1976 or even 75, the year before Heidegger's death, and that was volume 24, the Grundprobleme der Phänomenologie lectures, which some people have argued were going to be considered for the unfinished part or the unfinished half of Sein und Zeit. These appeared in 1982, and then another edition appeared in 1992, and the English translation also appeared, prepared by André Schuer and Richard Rochowitz in that same year. A final edition of this, a second edition of GA54 was also published in that year with some corrections. And then there is a newer version which appeared in 2018. I got hold of a copy in case there was anything remarkably different about it. It simply says in the Klostermann catalogue, durchgesehene, which can mean just about anything. I mean, from looked through to closely scrutinized. I've been unable to find any real material changes. Those of you who are even more attentive to texts than Aaron and I are perhaps can point out the differences when they appear. But I don't think that there is anything that will materially affect our considerations. And therefore, the texts that we will work for are the 1992 Klostermann edition and the 1992 translation by Schuler and Richard Rochowitz. As you know, Aaron prepares a weekly bilingual text. For copyright reasons, I have to ask you to destroy these or not keep them, and I'm sure that you'll all comply with that. I do want to say one thing about those texts. They take some time to prepare, and Aaron relies on some optical character recognition volumes where the optical character recognition is not always perfect, and the hyphenation is sometimes not perfect. So when we issue the parallel text, please don't regard it as a definitive version. If you want to work from a definitive version, get your own copies one way or another. And I'm sure you all know what I mean by or another. These are the parallel text that we issue is a working copy and no more than that. And I'm very grateful because I know how much time Aaron puts into preparing it, but we have it at all. But please don't rely on it. It's dangerous to do so, especially given Heidegger's propensity to hyphenate words. So you need, if you are concerned about the hyphen, you need to check whether the hyphenation is original to the German text or whether it's simply crept in through the OCR process or through the preparation of the text. Richard Rochowitz and André Schur were both competent and able translators of Heidegger, but this translation appeared very early on. And so a number of conventions that have become standard in more recent translations are simply not observed. If you've looked at the Zusatz, which I asked Aaron to circulate in advance of the discussion today, you'll have seen that all the way through, the German word der Anfang is translated as the beginning. It's customary now to translate this word really as inception. Fangen in German means to capture or to seize upon. And so capto, septo in Latin, and incepto and anfangen. Inception is really quite a good capturing or anfang of how to render the word anfang into English. And indeed, there is at least one text of Heidegger's that it considers in considerable and systematic detail the difference between a beginning and an inception. That's just one example. There are clunkinesses in any translation. So one of the bylaws, as it were, of this reading group is it is perfectly okay to criticize the translation. This does not mean disrespecting the translators. I know some of the members of this reading group have themselves been translators of Heidegger's text. And Aaron and I are working on a translation ourselves. Anyone who has tried to translate Heidegger into English knows a certain sound that appears after an hour or two of that work. It's a thumping sound. It's the sound of your own forehead banging the desk in frustration at trying to render often difficult German into English. So yes, we can be critical of the translation, but no, that does not mean we are critical of the translators. We've been privileged both with the Heraclitus lectures, I forgot to mention those, which we considered 3 years ago, and the translations of Hölderlin's Germania hymn lectures last year, to have had the translators appear, as it were, and discuss the translation that we're working from. I don't think we will do that this time. I've never spoken to Richard Rochowitz myself. I'm not sure, I hope he's still around, but he may not be. But I think it's long enough ago that it's probably best, so we're not planning to, unless there's a strong representation from the reading group, to ask him and André Schur to come and speak to us. GA54 is a strange text. It was delivered in the war years, in the winter semester of 1942-43, and it belongs to a triad of lectures, really. The two sets of lectures on Heraclitus that appeared as GA55, which we considered 2 years ago, and then the undelivered lecture course, and I don't to this day know why it was undelivered, which appeared as GA78 on Anaximander. These three, Heraclitus, Anaximander, and Parmenides, formed the basis of Heidegger's investigation into the early Greeks, really from quite early on, certainly from 1932, when Heidegger gave the lectures we now know as GA35, the beginning of Western philosophy, in 1932. Those were well-attended lectures. And those lectures are quite different in character to these. They're much more attentive to the actual fragments of Parmenides. A number of prominent philologists, including Kurt Rietzler, who published just 3 years later his own translation of Parmenides' fragments and dedicated them to Heidegger, in a dedication that disappeared after his death for reasons that have never been entirely clear to me. It's certainly true that a full transcript of those 1932 lectures was prepared. We know this because an American young woman who was in Freiburg in 1938, I think it was 38, it might have been slightly earlier, obtained a copy of that, and she quotes from it in an article that she published on her return to the United States before the outbreak of the Second World War. I can give you a copy of that article. It's quite critical of Heidegger. She obviously didn't like him or didn't like the work she did with him. But she quotes the opening sentence of GA 35, and it's word for word what's in the German text, except that there is a preceding sentence in the modern edition, which mentions or makes use of the word das Sein. And we will probably come on to discussing the meaning of being spelt with a Y at some point during these discussions, but I don't want to say more than that. For those of you who are not familiar with those 1932 lectures, I would strongly urge you to read them. And the reason for that is that I'm fairly confident that Heidegger himself expected people to obtain copies of those transcripts of the 1932 lectures for the 1942-43 lectures. There are lots of hints in the text and cross-references between the two. The editors of the original 1932 lectures hint strongly that much of what was preparatory, much of what was said in those lectures in 1932 was preparatory to much of the thinking of the Beiträge. And I think the reason why there is so little textual analysis of the fragments in these lectures, the 1942-43 lectures, is because Heidegger was relying on what he had said before and a knowledge among those present in the lectures of the 1932 lectures. Nevertheless, he does say in several places that the 1942-43 lectures get much further, he said, or proceed further along than the 1932 lectures. And that also will become clear, I hope. I don't know if I want to say much more about the lectures themselves. I think in retrospect, given the conventions that have been established since, and given some of the questions that we ourselves have raised and have become conventional in this reading group, there are clunkinesses now about the Rochowitz-Schur translation, and we will need to be aware of them. And I intend to point out one of them from the Zusatz towards the end of what I'm going to say today. There are substantial differences between these two lecture sets. First of all, in 1932, only half the lecture course was given to Parmenides, whereas the entire lecture course this time is. And secondly, as I've already said, there was far more actual close textual analysis. There's a presumption of an underlying knowledge. Why is that word der Anfang so important? If you, I wrote Aaron and I have a volume, a collected volume of coming out in May of next year, 2026. We hope it's going to be May, published in the series edited by Richard Polt and Greg Fried on Heidegger and Parmenides. Those essays, which come right across the spectrum of Heidegger scholars, I think there are 10 of them in total, consider in very great depth Heidegger's connection with Parmenides. It's certainly true that Heidegger was aware of Parmenides, or Parmenides was an influence on Heidegger's work very early on. In a seminar in 1952 in Müggenbrunn, Heidegger says, I gave my first Kolleg, he calls it, my first colloquium on Parmenides. Now, there's some dispute about that. Both Ted Casseel and Tom Sheehan have raised questions about what was actually in the first lecture course that Heidegger gave. We don't have the transcript of it. It was given in 1916. But the title that the university has for that lecture course certainly does not rule out that there was any consideration of Parmenides. Some years ago, in an essay that we've republished in the book that's coming out in May, Dan Dahlstrom offered the tentative thesis that Parmenides, or a consideration of Parmenides, lay behind much of the thinking of being and time, Sein und Zeit. I've argued myself in an essay in that in the collection that we're bringing out that in fact that tentative suggestion should be taken far more strongly, and I'll explain a little bit more about that before we finish today, I hope. But there are other things I want to say first. Almost every single volume of the Gesamtausgabe, I actually did an analysis, and there are only a handful of volumes of the now 100 and I think it's 104 volumes that are actually appeared. The Gesamtausgabe is now in 105 volumes, not 102, because 3 more volumes have been added, and some of them are double volumes, but then some of them are half volumes, as it were, so they kind of balance out. But there are only a few volumes of the Gesamtausgabe yet to come. The overwhelming majority of them make substantial, not merely incidental reference to Parmenides over and over again, especially to what Heidegger often referred to as fragment 5, and we all know as fragment 3 in the Diels-Krantz ordering. Roughly translated, and certainly not systematically, for the same is for thinking as is for being. Heidegger said that thought, that fragment, the then Diels fragment 5, now Diels-Krantz fragment 3, never left him, he said. It haunted him and it never left him. He considered it in some considerable detail in the as yet untranslated volume, which I think is volume 62, and Dan Dahlstrom makes a close analysis of that consideration in the essay that we've republished. And then there was the full systematic presentation in 1932. There are numerous other references. There are private lectures that were given in the 1930s and early 40s. And then there was a substantial revisiting of Parmenides and the consideration of Parmenides in texts like Was heißt denken, and in a lecture that was intended to be delivered as part of the lecture series that was published as Was heißt denken in 1954, which got left off. And that lecture appeared in publication elsewhere, first in, I think, in Hegelstudien, and then subsequently elsewhere. Nevertheless, although the Parmenides lectures were published relatively early, the other material on Heraclitus, which was published in German, was not translated, unlike these lectures. And then the Anaximander material suddenly appeared in 2012. Many Heidegger scholars, certainly those who don't have classical Greek, could have been forgiven for, at least to some extent, overlooking the extent to which Parmenides was both an influence for Heidegger and a concern for him. I think it's now impossible to say that Heidegger was not substantially and closely influenced by at least a very careful and systematic analysis of the interconnections between these thinkers, between Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Anaximander. And contrary to the way in which they were often interpreted in the 19th century, especially by Hegel, but also by people like Christian Brandis, in opposition to each other, Heidegger considers these 3 thinkers to be arguing from to auto, the same, from out of the same. We will have to ask ourselves in the weeks to come, what is meant by the same? But that word to auto, for the same, to gar auto, for indeed the same, is the issue under consideration all the way through this consideration of the Parmenidean fragments. It would not be true to say that Parmenides has been a long influence in philosophy. Plato's dialogue on the Parmenides was well known and was regarded as an adequate summary. So although fragmentary remains of Parmenides began to be collected in the Latin West, at least in Venice, from around about the 15th, 16th century onwards, they really weren't taken very seriously philosophically until the philologists began to take an interest in them around the person of Schleiermacher and the one or two other philologists. There were three or two editions that were published prior to Schleiermacher's translations of Plato. Schleiermacher made his own private collection of fragments, which he then handed on to Brandis, who was a pupil of his, and to Burke. And that collection went into the hands of Diels. Diels published Parmenides' Lehrgedichte, his doctrine of being, his doctrinal poem, Lehrgedichte, doctrinal poem, in the late 1890s. And then Diels published his Fragmenta de Vorsocratica, the fragments of the pre-Socratics. I always forget the exact date, but it's either 1899 or 1904. I can't remember exactly which. And that was revised again in 1934 by Walter Krantz, and therefore that's what we know as Diels Krantz. Heidegger knew these considerations intimately, but it's arguably, strongly arguable, in fact, that it was at the hands of the philologists, Schleiermacher and others, Diels, of course, and not the philosophers, that a careful and systematic consideration of Parmenides was retained. And so when Rudolf Carnap claimed that there was a long history of the word sein, on to on, being in Greek, in German, sein with a small s, by the way, which just means the participle, it just means being. In philosophy, he was wrong. There certainly is a long tradition of consideration of esse, being, the substantive form, and the medieval meditation on being concentrates on that. But the focus on to on the participial form, sein, and this peculiar, extraordinary word, which doesn't appear in this text, but certainly does appear in the 1932 lectures, das Sein, it seems to be an invention of Schleiermacher's, really comes from the philological tradition. A lot of the work that Aaron and I have done, and some of you have done that with us over the recent period, has shown how alive to the philological considerations Heidegger was. In 1916, Karl Reinhardt published his book on Parmenides and the earliest history of Greek philosophy. And Heidegger said in the text that the first really larger scale consideration of Parmenides that we have at Heidegger's pen, he says that although Reinhardt used largely average concepts, he says, to analyze the Parmenides fragments, nevertheless, Reinhardt made a fundamental breakthrough. Reinhardt argues that there are three paths named in the opening proemium of fragment one, as it were, of the Parmenides fragments. The way of aletheia, which we ordinarily translate as truth, but we would need to bracket that, and we can discuss that bracketing. Heidegger himself repudiates the simple translation of aletheia by the word Wahrheit, truth, at various points in his oeuvre. And then the other chodoi, or paths, are doxa, opinion. Doxa from dokein, seeming, and there'll be a consideration of that in the opening of the discussion that we will find in GA 54. But doxa is the third way. The second way is the way of non-being, meon or meeon, of non-being, which the goddess tells the Parmenidean thinker is not a way that mortals can undertake. Nevertheless, the question of non-being will haunt us all the way through this text. In Sein and Zeit, there is a discussion of the two ways of truth. that discussion is tied to two terms, das Wahr, the true, and the Unwahr, the untrue. And so many scholars, myself included, and this clearly foxed Dan Dahlstrom as well, it's present in that essay that we have republished, assumed that das Unwahr refers to the second way of Parmenides, to me on. But if you turn about 30 pages after the distinction in Sein und Zeit that Heidegger makes between das Wahr and das Unwahr, between Wahrheit and das Unwahr, you discover that Heidegger associates das Unwahr not with non-being, the second of Parmenides' ways, as described by Reinhardt, but the third, doxa. And this is exactly what the Parmenidean fragments say in a way that's not considered systematically in the text that we're going to consider. Das Unwahr, the way of doxa, is therefore a mixture of being and non-being. It is, as Parmenides says, the mere opinions of mortals. Doxa as mere opinion, the mere opinions of mortals, is therefore Gerede, is idle chatter, is not therefore the nothing or non-being as such, which Heidegger does consider in Sein und Zeit. And so when he refers to two ways in Sein und Zeit, he's actually referring to Reinhardt's first and third way. This is because there's a fundamental assumption by Heidegger that we know our Parmenides, as it were, and therefore that we know that we are unable, at least as far as Parmenides is concerned, to consider the way of non-being because it is not a way that mortals can take. Now, how it can be considered is something I think, again, we will want to consider in the coming weeks. But I would ask you to bear that in mind because you suddenly see something which I think has remained largely hidden, although Dan hints at it in his essay. And that is that the twin terms which we normally translate from Sein und Zeit as authenticity and inauthenticity are actually related to aletheia and doxa. In other words, I would contend, it is contentious, you can contend with me if you disagree, that what drives that analysis of authenticity and inauthenticity is something which Heidegger had derived, at least in part, from a consideration of Parmenides. And I think that has to be taken very seriously because it shows the extent to which being and time is shot through with an understanding of the Parmenidean fragments, and not, therefore, with an understanding, or it's not nearly as dependent on Aristotle's consideration of being, even if it is dependent on what Heidegger had understood as the way in which Aristotle, to some extent, preempts the model of phenomenology in Sein und Zeit. And it's there that I want to leave my primarily my remarks, except to then say just one or two smaller remarks about the Zusatz, because I see that time is wearing on, and I know that Aaron gets very fed up with me if I talk too long, and I was given half an hour, so I'm on the minute 32, and I'm going to run over a bit, but not much. A lot has been made of the fact that this text was written in wartime conditions. And indeed, there are still those around who want to put on their Nazi hunting hats and go at Heidegger with the question of the extent to which this text is, as it were, a text influenced by his own contamination with Nazism. So let me advance a very bold thesis. It became very clear, both in reading the Einführung in die Metaphysik lectures, which with its notorious statement about the inner truth and greatness of the movement, which is contrasted with what is everywhere peddled around these days as the philosophy of National Socialism. And I can say more about that if we have the time. And Heidegger's own consideration of the national taken as a theme in Hölderlin, to look at when we look at the Zusatz, to understand the context of these lectures. The Zusatz is simply an addendum that was never actually delivered at the time. It's not even clear to me that it was written at the time because of some of the things that are said in it, that show that even when Heidegger is considering Parmenides, he has to a very large degree in mind the question of the confrontation between humanity and modern planetary technology. That's what Heidegger says is the inner truth and greatness of the movement, which is otherwise peddled around as the philosophy of National Socialism. That confrontation, I would suggest to you, is still going on. We are still living it. There are lots of ways we could talk about das Gestell and the preparatory ways in which there are hints in this text towards that. There are certainly hints in the 1936 or 35 lectures, the Einführung in die Metaphysik lectures, in that direction. But simply to understand Heidegger as undertaking, as it were, an immediate program of German nationalism would be, I'm going to suggest, even in this text and even in the considerations of Hölderlin, a distraction from what he is really doing. And in order to illustrate that, I would like to turn to the section just a little after page 167. And this is in the interest of doing something in the reading groups that we're going to undertake in the weeks to come that I think we have learnt to do more and more over the last 5 years, but I'm going to press us, if I can, gently, because I don't believe in pushing anyone around or being bossy, but press us, nevertheless, to look increasingly closely at the German text. Because if you read the English translation just after page 167, we get this assertion. Well, let's look at the German first. So this is German page 250. I have to find it. I apologize, but I'm because I'm not at my normal desk. It's things are not as.
Is it where it starts wie aber?
Yes, wie aber. Wenn dasjenige geschichtliche Menschentum, das gleich den Griechen zum Dichten und Denken berufen ist, das Deutsche, wie aber, wenn dieses zuerst die Stimme des Seins vernehmen muss. Now, the Schur-Rotschewitz translation says this. What if German humanity is that historical humanity which, like the Greek, is called upon to poetize and think? And what if this German humanity must first perceive the voice of being? Those of you who were with us last year for the Hölderlin lectures will recognize that there is a commonality of theme, as it were. But I'm going to suggest that the the German doesn't really say what this says. For Deutsche here is not a noun. It's an adjective, the German, as a description, therefore. And the noun here is geschichtliche Menschentum, specifically dasjenige geschichtliche Menschentum, that very historical humanity. The translation that I would offer is, what, however, if that historical humanity, i.e. historical humanity overall, which akin to the Greeks, is called to poetry and thought? And then it's only in a dependent sense that it's named as the German. And it's named as the German not because we're all crypto-Nazis, not because we're all secret German nationalists, but because that is the context in which this lecture is being given. What if it must first apprehend the voice of being? Now, may I suggest to you that we do not understand a word of Heidegger at all unless we understand that every geschichtliche Menschentum no matter where it is, whether it is ein deutsche geschichtliche Menschentum oder englische oder amerikanisch, or wherever it is, Afrikanisch, must heed the voice of being, must therefore apprehend the voice of being. The Stimme des Seins, after all, is simultaneously both our own voice, it is through the voice, what is said, and the silence that lies before what is said, that is the Stimme des Seins, but also that being calls us to name what must be named, the nennen, as it were, of nehmen, the naming of apprehending. And that this calling to, this berufen, is something to which we are all called in our historical humanity. In other words, what is pressed upon us here is the understanding of the word historical. Because if we understand that, then we can ask, what follows? Then must not the sacrifices be as many as the causes immediately eliciting them? Since the sacrifice has in itself, and I'm going to suggest rather than an essence all its own, but has in itself its own unfolding and does not require goals and uses. Thus, what if the voice of the inception should announce itself in our historical destiny? But what do we mean, and this is where I'm going to end, what do we mean by an Anfang, an inception? What has become very clear to me in trying to understand not just this lecture course, but the whole range of Heidegger's discussion of Parmenides, is that being, inasmuch as it is chen, pan, suneches, the all, to pan, chen, one, and suneches, continuous. We're going to have to consider all of these things in the weeks to come. We understand these not as adjectives, not as descriptions, but in their verbal sense. The one ones, it unifies. It is an inception because it gathers, lesen. It gathers into logos, legein, which is lesen, legein are etymologically related. And therefore the one in its oneing, which has no past, no present, and no future, as Parmenides says, but nevertheless is what gathers us into the manifold, is how we must understand how Heidegger is touched himself by Parmenides. If we can see this, that we're not dealing, therefore, with nominal presentations, the being, the one, but rather with what ones. You'll find in Aristotle, for instance, even the word chenopoios, the one making, in the most curious use in part of his polemic against Plato. If we understand, therefore, that being through Parmenides, in one of the echoes of Parmenides, I think, in Aristotle's work, is itself chenopoios, one making, oneing, das einige ein, Heidegger says at one point, the oneing one. Then we have a chance to heed what is said in this lecture course. So with that, I'm going to end my opening remarks and say once again, a great welcome. I know many of you are excited. This is one of the best known of Heidegger's lecture courses and one of the most deeply considered, and therefore the chance for us to consider it again and to sit at its feet anew is, well, certainly going to be one of the highlights of my year. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Laurence. An excellent introduction to the text and for the year as well. For anybody who's new, we don't do the hands up system. It's just a scramble to who can shout the loudest. But I'm going to shout the loudest first because I'm sitting and I can see Alberto's ready to go, I think. So I'm going to go first and just ask you, Laurence. I mean, on this translation on page 250 of the German, what's really the issue? For me, it's ambiguous whether Heidegger's talking about specifically about a German historical humanity first, precisely, well, firstly because the mention of the Greeks, you know, why is he simply differentiating between modern historical humanity and a Greek, and why not just an ancient? Why is that? And then it's the use of Zurst as well as first. So why not? Why is he not talking about the Germans first being the ones to, I suppose, recall this inception? And so I don't quite see what the issue is if Heidegger does mean a German historical humanity first, precisely as well because you look back at Hölderlin, at Schiller, at Hegel. It's quite common for the Germans to see an affinity between themselves and the Greeks, without necessarily thinking of the West or the world in total.
I suppose what I'm trying to draw attention to is not because as I said, I think the context is everything, but the word that must lie behind this must be Dasein. And you and I have been looking at that word Dasein just recently because in a separate text from, I can't remember exactly when, but I think it's 1934. It's not very well known. It's in the Vorträge, the 2 volumes of lectures that came out, I think, around about 2012, 2018, where Heidegger makes an explicit connection between the word Dasein in German and Parousia in Greek. And you very often when you're teaching it, certainly at undergraduate level, you hear undergraduates start talking about a Dasein. Some Heidegger scholars even start to talk about a Dasein. And even Heidegger does this at certain times, certainly very early on, but he abandons it quite quickly because I think he sees the danger of it. Because what does Dasein actually mean? There is a curious sentence of Fichte's where Fichte draws a distinction between das Sein and Dasein. And he says, in das Sein, we know being through der Begriff, the concept. But in Dasein, we know being through, this is how we know through faith, Glaube, he says, and feeling, Gefühl. Now, I don't think he's referring specifically to Christian faith there. Rather, I think he's referring to Greek pistis. And I think you will remember that pistis is a word that occurs in the Parmenides fragments. And so the issue here is how you bring the moment to speak. And what speaks? What is the Stimme of Sein? Is it, as it were, the German voice or the English or the American or the African or whatever voice you're going to choose? Or rather, is it the moment itself? Now, you and I found the other day in Passau, in his 1828 dictionary, a most peculiar verb, paroudzisai, which means really to be present, as it were. Parousia, it takes parousia, which itself is derived from paremi. It's a kind of way of saying Dasein, actually, and say to do Dasein. That's what paroudzisai really says. This is the understanding of Dasein, I think, that has often been neglected. Dasein draws attention not to, as it were, a Dasein, but rather to the moment, to the immediacy and the prevailing character, the Walten, as Heidegger would say, the prevailing of the moment, how the moment rules. And it rules in such a way that everything falls into place because of it. It is the moment, it is through the moment that aletheia either is disclosive or degenerates into doxa. But it is the leading character of the moment that we have to attend to. So the Stimme here, the voice of being, must be the voice from out of the moment. Now, certainly in 1942-43, the question of the destiny of the German, das Deutsche, German taken again as an adjective, the destiny of what is German must be thrown open into question, because that's what the war experience will have done. But my suggestion is that the geschichtliche Menschentum that Heidegger is referring to is the overall historical context. In other words, if what I read in this text is if you get lost in immediate language of immediate sacrifice, you won't be able to understand anything at all. But if you are able to understand what is posed in this Stimme des Seins, in this voice of being, in this moment, in this moment, in this very moment, then you have a chance to reach in to what it is that the Greeks are also saying. There is that to gar auto, or indeed the same, at work. Fragment 3, or yes, fragment 3, as it is now for us, is at work. And so, not the emphasis, in other words, on a German victory or a German superiority, but rather what this moment, what the voice of being in this moment is able to draw us in to understand. That's what's at issue. The Da here of Da Sein.
I think this might be a sticking point throughout the year. It'll be interesting to see how it develops throughout the text. So I'll just open up to the group if anybody wants to chime in.
Well, it certainly would have been better if Heidegger used the word Dasein rather than German, or maybe German Dasein. That would have been better. I would like Laurence to be right. In other words, deepen this language rather than get bogged down in what he might have meant by German. But the reason I'm resisting is that I think that Heidegger's thought is not only relevant today because of technology, that's pretty obvious, but the rise of folk thinking today. And the question is, how does that happen? Why is that happening? And I think Heidegger has something to offer there. In other words, I don't want to say, oh well, the German thing, oh, that's a condemnation. I want to say that we have to think about why folk thinking has been resurgent.
Just to repeat what I just wrote down in the chat, I mean, it seems like this section on the German experience, or experiencing this moment Germanly, should be contextualized by the fact that he was just talking about the incredibly pregnant importance of suffering, or Schmerz. And I mean, by 42 and 43, the prospects for the war were changing for the worse. I think a lot of the smarter people in Germany were expecting an eventual loss. So I mean, I mean, even if we read this in a quote unquote nationalistic sense, first off, I didn't read it in a vainglorious sense. I think it was actually contextualized in the sense that we're going to have to undergo a crucial experience as a nation, and crucial in perhaps a negative sense. And I mean, I cannot help but just say I was so struck by the phrase, or the sentence, die höchste Gestalt des Schmerzes aber ist das Sterben des Todes, der das Menschsein opfert für die Wahrung der Wahrheit des Seins. I mean, this just controlled my entire thinking about this entire passage. Both Sterbens des Todes, which is not just, I mean, the translator says the suffering of one's death or the demise. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's one's death at all. It's the death of death almost, or the demise of death. And then the play of Wahrung and der Wahrheit. So Wahrung and Wahrheit. So it's the abidance of truth. I think it's critical both for the contextual moment in which Heidegger is saying this, and also an incredible insight into how to think about Heidegger's philosophy as such, because he talks about the truth of being itself, in the demise of death. It was just so fascinating to me.
Sterben des Todes, I assume, is the mortality of death. So, I mean, I think that Sterben there is a descriptor rather than the death of death itself, as it were. But this is the mortal character, just how mortal death can be. That's at least how I would read it. I mean, I do want to draw attention to the communality of themes with technology in the way that, for instance, the way that this passage, the Zusatz, which was never delivered, attacks the notion of simply conceiving the world in sociological or anthropological terms. That seems to me to be absolutely crucial. I mean, if there's anything that mires much contemporary debate, it is that inability to free ourselves from sociological or anthropological terms. And indeed, the way in which sociological terms have now been converted into or at least have become a form of marketing speak. Everybody will tell you what generation they belong to, and therefore what they're like. And they do it not totally seriously. I don't want to over dramatize this, but they do think it says something about them. Now the question is, do we derive the human from out of, and this is a point, and I know Alberto will want to discuss this in the lectures themselves as we go through them or undergo them. Do we derive our humanity from out of what society is, or is it in as much as we are human that the polis is? The other way around, in other words, that the polis arises on the basis of our being human, rather than that we are simply contained within the polis. And I think it has to be the polis holds us but does not contain us. I'm thinking of that word hypsolis that Heidegger uses from Sophocles, beyond the polis. The human being is both within and beyond the polis. Aaron, I think you're muted. You're muted, I think, Aaron. But Michael, do.
I was just handing over to Michael.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. I find myself in sympathy with both what everyone said, actually, and it's a very striking passage. I actually felt quite a bit of, I mean, it's a passage full of pathos, right? And I felt a lot of compassion. You know, and I think Laurence is right that Heidegger is writing as he's one of the people, and they're going down, and I mean it's a very I mean it's a very dramatic moment.
Frank, it's lovely to see you.
Oh, likewise. This is just so delightful. I share with you, Laurence. There's part of me that says, yes, I can see where, in some ways, the Nazi consideration is a distraction. But my fear is that in removing that, it doesn't allow Heidegger to speak to it. And I think it's very difficult. But for example, I think it's his piece on Plato is in a way a challenge to what grew out of the Stefan George circle about there are commentators who said, yes, the renewal of Germany goes back to Plato. And Heidegger is denying that. And also by doing so, pushing it back towards the Anfang. And so my concern is, and over the summer, I think I told both you and Aaron, I've spent a lot of time on Kurt Hanke, who takes Hölderlin in a different direction. and it's very interesting. The whole thing is very interesting to me in relation to, we don't know what happened when Hanke was a student, a spy for the SD, that is Sicherheitsdienst, and we don't know what the conversations were like, but it's very interesting to me.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think there are two things. Well, there are two things I just want to say. I mean, one is that this is a period in which Heidegger is working out very much what he means by the andere Anfang, the other inception, what that really means. He's looking forward. The GA78, the Anaximander lectures that Aaron and I are working on at the moment, is full of the discussion of a zukünftiger Denken, of a future thinking, a futural thinking that is yet to come. And that therefore what Heidegger believes he's doing is preparatory in some way. And I think the work that I've myself been doing on Parmenides in the last months has reassured me to an extraordinary degree, far more so than I think I ever understood before, the extent to which a return to understanding what is laid out in that first inception is crucial. Is crucial here. Alberto, I'm going to let you in because I talk too much.
No, I wonder whether you, well, first of all, it's great being here and to initiate the new seminar, the new year. But I wonder what you make of the top paragraph in page 3 in Aaron's handout, when he talks about the Roman and Christianity and religion, because I think that there is a hint there that religion, which is of course something that the Nazis did not like, okay, has become part of the resistance in Heidegger's seminars. In other words, that there are people seriously concerned about religion, and this would be a resistance to Nazism. What do you make of that? I mean, this interesting response from Heidegger to critiques coming from religious people. And then what he says, my interpretation of aletheia is good for Christianity. It's good for Christianity. What do you make of that?
I mean, I found you're absolutely right. It's an intriguing passage, and it does beg for me the question of when this text was written, whether it was written at the time or not. Let us leave it for theology to decide whether the meditation on the essence of truth, the Wesen auf das Wesen der Wahrheit, we have attempted here, could not, taken in context, be more fruitful for the preservation of Christianity than the aberrant desire to construct new scientifically founded proofs for the existence of God. And then we get this extraordinary reference, and this is why I have doubts about the provenance of this passage, of the reference to Atomphysik, because I don't know how aware, maybe he was, but if he was, I'm unaware of it, how aware of Atomphysik Heidegger was.
Through Werner Heisenberg, quite aware, through Heisenberg.
Yeah, but whether it was this much on the table, as it were, in 1942, then it might have been after the war, but I don't know. That's the doubt in my mind. But I'm open to being. I mean, he avoids religion, is the truth, and I think I see in this as yet again a setting aside. If you want to do Christianity, you're not going to do it through some even more advanced scientific rationality. That's what this passage seems to me to be saying. In other words, the conversion of Christianity into a mode of anthropology, which is very much a feature of 1930s and post-war theology, is not a fruitful way forward if you want to be a Christian. That's how I read that passage. I have considerable sympathy for that.
I found Alberto's point really convincing. It seems to me that he is kind of opening the door to Christianity, and it makes sense that his Christian students would be more kind of resistant. I think Heidegger's very anti-regime. this point, isn't he? I mean, he's anti-regime, but he's still fully in solidarity with the destiny of the German, folk and so forth. I thought that was interesting that he does open. There's quite a subtle, from memory from the last time I read this text, which was like more than 10 years ago, there's a subtle engagement with Christian theology throughout the seminar.
Right. Yeah.
Laurence, are you in
Sebastian.
a rush to get back to
Oh,
sorry.
yeah,
I'm not in a
Yes.
Sebastian, sorry. Do please.
No, it's okay. I just thank you for accepting me to the group and I'm being here. And I'm also interested in this idea of Stimme and Stimmung, voice, and hearing the voice of being, because I study philosophy of music, and the musical aspect of hearing is very important, for not only for Heraclitus' logos, hearing the logos, and also in the Neoplatonic tradition, I find it that this is connected to all this idea of synecheia in Parmenides, but also is this idea that we are hearing something that is beyond audition, for in the Neoplatonic and Pythagorean tradition, connected to negative theology, or to the negative and the nothingness, which is this ground where everything resounds, the resounding of the voice in this silence. So I was thinking that maybe the way of transcending this idea that the voice has some kind of national characteristic, we can tie or connect it to the idea that music connects this idea of a universal kind of connection with sound. Maybe it could be related to the romantic project of finding what is Sherman music from Beethoven to Wagner, but at the same time trying to find a universality in music. Can we connect this with Hölderlin or Heidegger vision on Hölderlin, and this idea of the Sherman and the music that is universal?
Thank you. Heidegger is astonishingly silent on musical issues, as you probably know. Yeah.
Sometimes we can apply his views on poetry to music, maybe.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, I find that the point about this voice of being is, for me, very, very interesting. I'm not sure I've got to the bottom of it, even though it's something that comes up all the way through in Being and Time and so forth. Because on the one hand, Heidegger seems to want to distance himself from anything like theology. On the other hand, it's kind of hard to, and to understand what voice means without thinking in terms of music or theology or poetry.
Although this preempts the kinds of statements that are made in the 1950s, but isn't don't we have to hear in this that, as it were, die Sprache spricht, it's language that speaks, der Mensch entspricht, the human being corresponds to what is said. In other words, we don't have to look for a being with a throat, or rather that being, the only being with a throat that we have to look for is that being that we ourselves are, Dasein. And that would help us to understand the voice of being, therefore, is not the throat itself, but the what can be said. And the what can be said is as it were called out of us, rather than simply what we will to say.
Homo legen.
Laurence, then, can I well, actually, everybody who's spoken, can I ask then? It's the question that was on my mind during your paper, Laurence. We saw in the reading of GA35, we saw a new commitment to a reading of Parmenides and Anaximander, and then we saw, in places a new reading of Heraclitus in GA40 and other texts in the mid-30s. So we saw this engagement with the Greeks in the early 30s, and they never go away. But then suddenly we get in 1942, a prepared lecture course on Anaximander. We get this course in 42, 43, and then 43, 44, we get the Heraclitus course. So, and I'm thinking in terms of Casey's comment as well, there's a compassion here, maybe a forlornness. Is it Heidegger preparing for a post-war Germany that must rebuild and thinking again about Parmenides and Anaximander and Heraclitus in that context? Therefore, it doesn't need to be, talking about National Socialism as it stands, but possibly post-National Socialism.
Yeah.
I mean, there are two things I have in mind there. I mean, one is the discussion in 1945 of die Verwüstung, the devastation, where he says that, and he's clearly surrounded by devastation, as Germany is devastated in 1945, but he says that the worst kind of devastation is that devastation which occurs not in the context of war, but in the context of peace. In other words, but I'm not sure. I think it's dangerous to speculate on the extent to which anybody was speculating on what was going to come next. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to suggest that rather than, as it were, a question of a systematic or worked out kind of program or German nationalism, that we have rather to hear this word that I dug up, Parosiazo, of gegenwärtig anwesend sein, as Passau has it, presently, or being present, which seems to me to be far more urgent. I mean, it seems unsurprising to me that 1946 there's a breakdown, as it were, there is a convulsion. Going back to the earlier point about die Sprache spricht, der Mensch entspricht, that's pretty much what the beginning of page 249 says. Es ist das Wesen des Wortes stimmt und bestimmt erst das Wesen des ihm entsprechenden Menschentums. I would translate this not as the essence, but the unfolding of the word alone disposes and determines the essence or the unfolding of the humanity corresponding to it, and thereby assigns. I mean, Schur and Rochovitz have relegate, but I think that's wrong. It's the corresponding to it, and thereby assigns this unfolding to history, i.e., into the essential big inception of unfolding. Das heißt, in den Wesensanfang und Wandel des Wesens der Wahrheit des Seienden. So the unfolding of the truth of, now there I would translate das Seiende as simply the present. So into the essential inception and transformation of the essence of the truth of the present.
Does das Sein precede das Wort in this passage? It seems to me that it does, but I'm partial to wanting that answer already.
but das Sein is itself also das Nichts, and so it's both the word and the silence of the word. It's the Verschweigen, it's the holding back of the word and then the uttering of the word. Because das Sein ist kein Seiendes. Being is no being. It's no presencing, is presencing of what is present. The das Sein here I would translate from Anwesen, presencing. Well, it's
is
the
Homo
word.
leg?
Sorry.
No, sorry, I was almost going to close, but I'll carry on. Well,
Is homolegen vocal or not?
Homolegen. Well, wouldn't entsprechend also be a translation of homolegen?
I always think of homolegen really as laying down the same, but not necessarily vocal.
It's an ambiguous word. You know, the gathering in of the same, but the gathering in of the same is the saying of the word. The word is what gathers. But the word which comes out of a hesitation, a silence before it's uttered. Aaron, we're at 1 hour 22 and we said we were going to be an hour.
Yeah, well, indeed. Well, can we thank Laurence again for his presentation? It's been a really rich discussion afterwards. So we've gone over a little bit, but it's so nice to be back, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone again for next week's session. Thank you very much.
Good. Just before we go, should we say one word? We are going to reconsider slightly how we do the introductions, and so I think we will look after that ourselves for a week or two. But I'm going to ask when those who do introduce really to focus on the text rather than on a summary of the argument. So to draw attention to issues in the text, if I may. I should have said that in the housekeeping section of what I said. Thank you, everybody. It's lovely to be back. Thank you.
Thank you.